back to our podcast, From Languishing to Living. In today's episode, we're talking about something that seems simple, but is profoundly therapeutic: play. Yes, even for teenagers. I'm your host, Tiffany Silva Herlin, a licensed clinical social worker, and I'll be speaking with Dr. Matt Hoag, a clinical psychologist from ThreePeaks Ascent, about why play is critical for development, mental wellness, and connection, and how we as parents can reintroduce play, creativity, and joy into our teens' lives, even in small ways. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy. Please always seek a mental health professional for your situation. All right, Matt, thanks for coming back.
Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this. Let's talk about play.
Okay.
How you guys get to play out in nature, which is, I think, everyone's dream job.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, nature-based therapy is a fantastic place to work and be. It's kind of funny because I think at times my children will laugh at me when I put on a pair of pants because they're like, why are you dressing up, Dad? Because they're used to seeing me in shorts and that kind of thing. Because at Three Peaks, we might be playing with a hacky sack. We might be playing Frisbee. We might be going mountain biking. There's a variety of different activities that we find to be effective ways to essentially reintroduce play or to create ways for young people to reconnect with that play-oriented part of themselves while they're in treatment.
Well, okay, many people think that play is just for kids, but why does it still matter for teens?
It matters for all of us, actually.
It's true.
And the reality is that we, in our desire to overschedule, over plan, or create all these things that we must do, that we have gotten away from both nature and this idea of play, so that we're not actually considering the very things that make us healthy humans. So for teenagers, again, some of them have gotten away from play because they're growing up and they think that's part of their developmental process. And by that, I don't mean like they're thinking like, oh, I got to develop the right way, but they're like, oh yeah, that's what kids do. Like,
yeah, I'm not a baby anymore.
Yeah, no, I'm going to play for a first person shooter game, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. Like, or they get caught up in sports, or sometimes as parents, we like to overplan our kids' lives too and have them go from one activity to another. And so there's not enough downtime. There's not enough opportunities to be and to just enjoy. And some of the beauty of Three Peaks, or the idea of like nature-based therapy, is this opportunity to relax and be creative and use your imagination. And I'm struck by something as simple as like some of the group members being excited about playing chess, and they've drawn this chessboard on a piece of wood, and they've put, sometimes they carve or make their own pieces, or sometimes they even just put them on a piece of paper if they don't want to actually do any carving or any of those kinds of things. And so, but they get pretty excited about some pretty simplistic types of activities that you might think are not really that interesting if you're a teenager. Yeah,
we talked about boredom in our last episode, and one thing I wanted to point out is that when someone's bored, that's the time where your brain starts really working and they can become the most creative.
Yeah.
So if you're bored or your kids are bored, let them be bored, because some amazing creativity and sometimes mischievousness, right? It can come out of it. Especially, I have a 2-year-old, so if it's quiet and they're bored, then I know I'm in trouble because they've come up with something creative.
Something's being broken into in your house, yes. One of those drawers.
Yes, exactly. But no, it's a really good thing. In the book, he talks about a couple of studies that I really would love to point out that really caught my attention. First of all, he talks about how play is a protection for kids and adults. It's especially kids and teens who are in a difficult life situation. It allows to buffer the trials that they're facing. So if they come from low income, they're coming from poverty, maybe they don't have the family support system at home that they need. Play really allows for them to kind of escape and navigate those complexities of life at a young age, right?
Yeah. I think in many ways it helps with balance and helps with us just having balance to our lives. And so if you think about, growing up and that they dedicated playtime, not only in kindergarten, but throughout elementary school, and the importance of that. Partly, I think, because they needed a break from the children, perhaps, but the idea of like having that chance to, whether it's be outside, whether it's to go play on the playground, like we don't go play on the playground anymore.
Yeah, it's structured.
As teenagers or adults, like that's just not the thing we do anymore. But that idea of like, how do we have an imagination, or how do we do different things that get us out of our comfort zones or get us out of kind of the rigidity of like how we think we should be living our lives or what we should be doing as adults or teenagers. And again, similar to what we were talking about in the last episode, it also gets us out of holding that device or looking at that device. One of my favorite stories about this has to do with like, I think it's Pokemon that people kind of go around with their phones and they're getting different things, but they're actually outside with their phones, which is a step, but probably not exactly the step we're looking for here, but it is a form of play that's kind of tapping back into that imaginative kind of silly part of ourselves that sometimes we forget about when we get caught up with all the things we think we should be doing, either again as a teenager or even as adults, where we think like, got to work, I got to take care of the kids, I got to do this. Like, do we take time for play for ourselves again?
Yeah. I have some of my kids really have gotten into Dungeons and Dragons. And back when I grown up, that was like a really nerdy thing to do. Now it's like a cool thing to do, I think. But it's so cool because it's not this structured game. It allows for this creativity and, you know, kind of choose your own adventure and a cool way for teenagers to have an outlet to go play. And it's been really fun for them to kind of embrace this and get into that world. A couple of studies that Corey pointed out in his book. So you talked about with kids growing up and having time to go out and play on the playground. There was a preschool study in the 1960s that was really popular that they compared self-initiative versus self-directed teaching. They found that direct instruction generally showed greater initial academic gains, while self-initiative, play-based approach may have fostered long-term development of high-ordered thinking skills and social emotional development. It suggests that play-based approaches could lead to stronger social emotional outcomes and reduce need for special education later in life. Basically, I mean, it really just showed the importance of allowing for self-initiative in that play-based approach of how incredibly important it is in our schools and kids' development.
Yeah, if you think about it, the idea of like so many of our young people being kind of more oriented to their devices or the direction that their devices take them. And so, again, there's a randomness or there's again, you're talking about creativity, like that occurs when we're not guided by whatever that app is guiding us to or whatever that thing is that we think we need to match up with our peers. If you know, the most creativity I think we see sometimes is the number of either videos or types of selfies that sometimes young people can get caught up with.
Or the TikTok dances,
but
right?
Yeah. And so that can be a different kind of creativity. But here we're talking about the idea of like where they're actually left to just engaging, and back to that connectedness we were talking about earlier, engaging with each other, having fun with each other. It's the, you know, creating a spaceship out of the playground area, or if you're, you know, in some trees or what, you know, it's just doing different things where you're like, hey, I'm this, or hey, I'm that, you know, and we take on these different roles and we do these different silly things, and some of that, again, silliness or some of that playfulness, I think is part of what that research is showing as far as the level of creativeness and thinking for themselves versus, again, just responding to like a more rigid or sort of particular way of thinking about the world. Yeah.
I mean, in actually the book, The Anxious Generation, which we talked about in the previous mini-series before this one, he talked about how often playgrounds are so structured now and supervised that you actually need less of that. Allow kids to be a little more self-initiative. I think one of my fondest memories is making daisy chains out in the field for hours with my friends, or pretending that we were digging for dinosaur bones in the dugout. You know, that's what we were doing. And that stuff is just so incredibly important to the development of, you know, who we become as adults, and we lose it as adults. Joe Frost, actually, who I believe he is a play psychologist, found that children who are deprived of play when they are younger are shown to display reduced resilience in adverse situation, lower levels of self-control, difficulty relating to others socially and emotionally, and ultimately play helps build a brighter future for our kids and our teens and into adulthood.
Yeah, I think about like even at ThreePeaks and some of the work or some of the play, I guess you could say, which, again, I think different researchers have talked about even play being a child's work as far as that goes, and the importance of play is that it's actually their work, kind of like we're talking about with teenagers, some of their work is going to school and some of those things. So again, that idea of like play becoming an important piece of our lives as far as having, back to that idea of balance, but also like them learning how to work with one another, play with one another is really what I'm saying there.
Yeah,
sometimes it's as simple as like sharing the ball, or it's like, okay, this thing happened. How do they resolve that? How do they talk about that? Versus again, just being narrowly focused, whether it's a device, whether it's, a very particular, sports teach us a lot of resiliency too.
Yeah.
And if we're going from activity to activity to activity, there's not enough perhaps downtime, so to speak, to be with ourselves in a way that allows us to learn about ourselves in unstructured settings and unstructured activities in random or challenging situations that don't necessarily fit into one little box.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, I think in what we learn in child development, I remember my classes that play is just the way that kids learn because they don't necessarily have the vocabulary to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. So like you said, they may act different things out, struggles that they're having, things they're trying to process.
Yeah.
And it's just so important for them to grow and to learn and to conceptualize the world around them.
Yeah, sometimes it's as simple when you see little children and they've got different characters. Sometimes they get them at McDonald's or in their Happy Meals and they're like, what's happening over here? Well, this kid doesn't get along with these kids and he's doing this and they don't like each other anymore. So now they're over here. And so some of that simple kind of role playing, kind of acting out, sometimes they're acting out their own stuff that happened at school that day. And sometimes they're working out like a fight they had with their brother or their sister. And so some of those, again, when we think about little mini characters and some of the playfulness that young people have with that, like the ability to sort of see how relationships work, to think about that connectedness, to think about, how to resolve or deal with stress, because like obviously lots of us are still stressed. We're not, just because we're adults doesn't mean we've got that figured out.
Yeah.
And so that dynamic of them practicing and looking at that and then telling us about it sometimes through their imaginative play with like little characters, or you think about one of my grandchildren has these Mutant Ninja Turtles. They've come back now, of course. And so he's talking through the different characters and the meaning of those. And he's like, well, this one does this and this one does that. And he's telling me all this whole story. And sometimes that's the story and the playfulness we're having. And this person's doing that, They don't even have to match the characters anymore. It's just that fun of being creative and thoughtful as far as like, how do people have relationships? And so the more they can learn that at a younger age and continue to learn that, the more practice they get at doing that in real life.
Yeah, I actually am just going through potty training with my 2-year-old, and she has this rabbit and this doll, and she now has them go through the steps. She's like actually washed them in the sink before because they had to wash their hands, and gone through, like, she's processing it, and she does it. Oh, like Rah-Rah, she calls her rabbit. Rah-Rah now has to go potty, and she pretends and runs in the bathroom, and so it's like so cool. So let's talk about, what does healthy play look like for a teenager?
It's really doing anything that's not like built into their structured life. When you think about like school, you think about sports activities, some of those things that are already kind of designed for them. So healthy play is sometimes, it's as funny as it sounds, like maybe for us growing up, it was like toilet papering somebody's house. It's perhaps even sneaking out and doing something. And then this kind of, but again, within the range of appropriateness, of course, but sometimes that sort of creative kind of getting outside of the bounds of what they typically do. Sometimes it's building a fort. I remember building things in the backyard sometimes with the leftover wood, or from the house that's being built next door and you're getting stuff from their garbage, and it's just that kind of out of the box doing something different. And sometimes this is like, it coincides with some of their hobbies and interests. You mentioned the idea of Dungeons and Dragons, and I know growing up, I have first edition Dungeons and Dragons manuals, by the way, but
that's awesome.
That kind of growing up.
My daughter would geek out with you majorly right now.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the like stepping into a situation you don't know what's going to happen, and the dungeon master is sort of setting up the monsters or the fight that way, and it's that idea of like, how do we manage some of those stressors as far as how we're going to handle this or do this, and we want to do this, and we're going to come together like this, and I have this character that's like this, and so it's this kind of fun dynamic of doing something that's not typically. I remember staying up till like 3 a.m. on a weekend until we could drive, by the way, and then we stopped playing because we were excited about girls at the time. But the idea of like, we do these playful activities that really stretch us and get us thinking about the world in a different way, and so I think that's what we look for and try to create or invite our teenagers to do even these days, that sort of finding ways to do things that aren't their usual way of doing things.
I think some of my favorite memories growing up was doing games out in the field, summer fields at night, like capture the flag at night. Yeah. Just some of the coolest scenes that our kids need. They need to get out and be in touch with nature and disconnect from their phones and be more, spontaneous.
Yeah. You think about even just like, depending upon what kind of city or area you grew up in, it's like shooting baskets at the elementary school at 10 o'clock at night. Mm-hmm. For some reason, that's really exciting and fun because maybe you weren't supposed to be there, or it's later. Yeah. Again, certain circumstances that could be dangerous, but again, that idea of like doing something that maybe you just haven't done before in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, I even have another memory. We used to go to the beach, and for some reason, every year, and going out for a night swim at like 8 o'clock at night. Like our parents knew, but it was just exciting because it wasn't the normal time that we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And play is often led then by, when we think about it for teenagers, like by their imagination, by their creativity, so that it's not just, again, something that's in a box or in a schedule. Yeah. And so some of that might be just like, hey, we're going to go on this walk at night, or we're going to go hang out on the porch, and they're having these conversations, and sometimes it's like stretching some of the limits of the boundaries, but it's also like safe, and they're having some fun with like thinking for themselves, and that thinking for themselves part, I think, is the meaningful part of play, because then it's not just being guided, again, back to that individuation process as teenagers. It's not just being guided by the adults. It's not being guided by what they should be doing, whether it's like, I'm going to become, this because I like this, or I'm going to do this, go to college, and all those things that we kind of at times overemphasize for our children that they get caught up with. It's like them thinking for themselves and trying something else out in a different way.
Yeah. And I think for our listeners and parents, it's important to realize that teenagers taking risks and kind of pushing the boundaries is normal teenage development. Right. Yeah. In fact, we want them to within a safe realm, right? Yeah. Like, so if they do go sneak out and go teepee a friend's yard, like, don't punish them. Like, yes, okay, within reason, we don't want to upset the parents, and it is important to follow various rules. But ultimately, like, that's so much better than doing drugs. Right. Spending hours online at night, playing video games, or whatever other vice you may have, right? You want your kids to experience and do what we call like risky play as teenagers that won't cause harm and long-lasting effects, right? Because that's how they figure things out, like you were saying. So let's talk about how play can be tied to brain development, regulation, and resilience. In the book that Corey wrote on Languishing, he talks about that the definition of play includes that it must be optional, like you said. It's got to be spontaneous, can't be mandated. And Stuart Brown, a psychiatrist and head of the National Institute of Play, argues that unstructured play is essential to our flourishing as adults. Yeah. I want our listeners to hear that again. Not children, flourishing as adults.
I think he even cites it as like one of the 5 vitamins that are important as well, or something like that. Yeah.
So why do we need to play as adults?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think for the same reason as kids or teenagers do. Like, the more that we are focused on all the other responsibilities in our life, again, where we need that balance, or that sort of, again, our own sort of brains, or our own sort of like stress release, like being unwound, or again, so that creative part of our brains, or that part of our brains that doesn't fit always into all the other things that we do. Like, we're very structured, very cognitive, stress oriented. Like I mentioned earlier in an earlier episode about like we overplan, we overcommit, we pride ourselves on our busyness sometimes. And so that ability to unwind, let go of, again, you think about all the mindfulness, and whether we talk about meditation, whether we talk again about just that ability to be present with ourselves, like, can we create connections that aren't just tied to our responsibilities, that aren't just tied to things that we must do. And so whether it's the creativeness of our own play, whether it's that kind of silly, like some people, dress up in Civil War and do reenactments and do those kinds of things. And that's what really floats their boat or gets them excited about things in their lives. Some people go mountain biking. Some people go on hikes. Again, some of that ability as adults to find time for our own kind of reconnection with nature, our own reconnection with those parts of ourselves that are vital to our balance. Like if we don't actually have enough play, I think we increase. I think that's the whole languishing, flourishing dichotomy that he's talking about, is this idea like if we're so focused on all these other things, we're actually going to be in that meh place. And flourishing, again, one of the vitamins of flourishing has to do with like, how do we play? How do we find time to be entertained in a way that's not like scheduled?
Well, it's interesting. He talks about this passive leisure versus active leisure. I really like that section because we've moved into this passive leisure where, maybe because we have a car and a cell phone and a movie theater, leisure used to be, standing up and doing things, but now it's sitting and consuming things, right? Which sometimes is just not as enjoyable. It doesn't activate our brain as much. Realizing the difference that just because, you're sitting and watching a movie or listening to a book or doing something that's considered fun and playful and leisure doesn't necessarily mean it's as productive.
Yeah. I mean, we live in a materialistic world where things are just handed to us. We pull up to a drive-through and we get our meal. Like sometimes I find in kind of a meditative way, cleaning the kitchen. My wife loves this one, by the way. That cleaning the kitchen can be this meditative state for me, where I'm caught up with doing this task in a way that requires me to be present with it in a way that's different. So that even like we're so used to like, okay, now we have all these streaming services where we can not have to wait week after week to find out what happens to Johnny and whether, he reconnects with his long lost friend or whatever. And whatever show we're watching, we can just binge 3 seasons in a weekend, and we're totally consumed by it, but we haven't actually done anything. We like it, we enjoy it, but again, that passivity that you're talking about, or that sort of idea where we don't have to do anything to actually be a part of it, we're just being fed, and we're not actually then, like I might sit for 5 hours with my wife and think like, wow, I just spent a great evening with my wife, but we didn't do anything together.
Yeah.
We hit play, we went on to the next episode, we did those things, but we didn't actually connect.
That's the same thing with social media.
Right.
We consume all this social media, which is connecting, but we didn't really connect with people.
Yeah.
And he talks, I've said in the last episode, he talks about the second you go to post that cool vacation you had on there and worried about all the likes you're going to get, it becomes a theme, not an actual experience. And that was the other thing he talked about, is collecting experiences, not things.
Yeah.
Make play part of, a trip, but not a trip that's going to stress you out. He talked about that too, right? Like that sometimes we get so consumed with these expensive new lavish trips that we now have to post pictures about and everyone needs to see, that it no longer is enjoyable and it becomes a thing versus, it doesn't matter if you book a 5-star hotel in Hawaii versus a 3-star in Nashville, Tennessee. Like if you are stressed out about it or your kids are screaming at you in either place, it's not going to matter. You're not going to have fun.
Yeah.
No matter where you went.
And sometimes we're so focused on like letting other people know what cool things we're doing. Yeah. We're then not actually present with the cool things we're doing.
Yeah. Exactly.
We're not actually there because we're spending an hour or two editing our photos and making sure we got the right ones. We take 500 pictures and post 10. And that can take hours, and sometimes that consumes us on the very thing we're claiming to be enjoying while we're doing it. So again, are you present with even the 5-star experience, so to speak?
Exactly. And I want to go back to like cleaning the kitchen.
Yeah.
I was just thinking like we can start implementing play more in our lives, even a simple thing like cleaning the kitchen. I love putting on like my favorite tunes with my kids and doing kitchen dancing while we're cleaning or cooking. And so it's not like, yes, I'm doing a task and a chore, but the second we kind of let loose and start giggling, and we can all giggle. And my husband will tell you, it's funny, you talked about it being a stress release. It's also, I think, an emotional regulation as well. When I've had a really hard week, I'll hit like an hour. I have a bewitching hour at 10 o'clock, and I get the giggles. And it's like I turn into this 12-year-old girl, and my husband is like, "You're broken."
Yeah.
But it's because I'm like, my body just needs to let it go.
Yeah.
Whatever has happened, and so we all can find those moments to release that stress, reconnect with our inner child, help regulate the emotions we've had throughout the week, which can be stressful and hard and cause the languishing and the burnout and the depression, the anxiety, all those things that we're just so overburdened with.
Yeah.
If we can't find those moments to let loose and be a kid again, we're going to be stuck in languishing.
One of the assignments I often give people in treatment is this assignment called the mandala, where I'm asking them to look at the different parts of themselves. And the one that often sticks out in the kind of along the lines of the story you were just telling is like that 10-year-old self or that 8-year-old self. And I'll often joke with them that my wife isn't always a fan of the 7-year-old self, other than the goofy, silly part of it, because sometimes that's also my immature self. That's my justification for being childish or dumb or, making jokes that are about farts and those kinds of things that men sometimes still like to do. And so that idea of like being aware that we have these different parts or aspects of self that could be, again, along the lines of play, could be more oriented to kind of like the goofy, silly, being playful, silly, and letting go of and not just being caught up with things. There might be the artist part of yourself, but again, helping them recognize that there's these different parts or aspects of self, and that at times we may emphasize some over others. And part of the invitation or the challenge with that kind of assignment is I have them look at that pre-treatment. I have them look at that where they're at with treatment now and where they see those parts being emphasized. Again, when they're in nature-based therapy, they tend to reconnect, whether it's that younger self or that, again, sometimes it's the athlete, if they're depending upon the kind of games and how they're looking about their games, because sometimes they've drifted away from that. And then also to look at like the future, whatever that future is defined. Is it a year? Is it 5 years? Is it an adult? How do they want to see that constellation of parts around kind of their soul or their center? And so that idea of like thinking about like how we are developing. Again, going back to some of your earlier questions about like the importance of play for teenagers, for us as adults. Again, how do we find ways to connect with those parts, aspects, whether it's hobbies, whether it's interests, whether it's, again, we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Again, just that idea of being thoughtful about like, how do we remember that we have those parts of selves that are still interesting to us, even if we think they're maybe beneath us because we're getting, we're 16 now. We don't do those things.
Well, I love that you talked about play helps reconnect with key parts of ourselves, because that's what Corey talks about in his book. And I love that example of the mandala, trying to help them conceptualize who they are and reconnect maybe back with themselves, because there's been that disconnect. Corey also talks about how play helps us reconnect, like I said, with key parts of ourselves that gets lost in the responsibility of adulthood, which I think teenagers feel that pressure of. And he talks about that too, about college. He's a professor, about how these college kids are just so stuck on what are they missing out on, the FOMO. And they forget to be kids. And I think our teenagers too, reconnects us with our imagination, helps us approach life with excitement, energy, and humor again. And it really helps us discover and appreciate ourselves and beauty. It really just boosts our overall life satisfaction.
What I really appreciated about him talking about that class in his book, the idea of just like how he changed his class in a way that invited them and met them really where they were as young adults. As far as and how much more interesting his class became. People would cry. People would talk about different aspects of them. Not that he was trying to create a therapeutic experience, but it sounded like he created a therapeutic experience by actually meeting his students where they were, finding a way to relate to them. I think he talked about playing YouTube videos and some of the different things that he tried as a way to like enlighten them or connect with them. And I think that parallels, what we try to do in treatment, which is to try to help young people to connect with parts of themselves that maybe they're not considering. Again, like you said, like in his class, they're just so focused on like getting onto that next thing and that type of thing. And my favorite comment sometimes from young people in the wilderness was like, I'm 16, I'm practically an adult. And it's sort of this attitude of like, I've got this all figured out. And the reality is like, if we're indicating that to our teenage children, like we're probably misguiding them by not allowing them to still be 16, or sometimes with the trauma and the challenge in their life, they've had to grow up pretty fast. And so to help them reconnect and to be thinking about some aspects of their self, whether it's play, whether it's that artistic part of themselves that they pushed away from because that's not cool anymore, or whether it's this idea of like, wow, like I've had this trauma happen to me, and so now I'm having to deal with these heavy subjects that are really difficult to, and yet now I'm really excited about kicking this hacky sack around with my group mates that allows for me to do something different than to be so stuck in my head about either this trauma or something difficult in my life.
That leads me to this question of, how do you use play out at Three Peaks to help heal people going through trauma or an emotional shutdown?
It's interesting because sometimes there can be a series of group therapy kind of situations. Sometimes they're more like psychoeducational kind of groups. And after a while, our guides or our staff are well versed in like, we've been sitting for a while. We need to get up and move. Sometimes that's to play hacky sack. Sometimes that's to go gather wood for the fire kind of things. Sometimes that's about like, let's go watch this sunset. Again, it's this idea of like, how do we keep them connected with the physical aspect of self? Because again, we're by having nature-based therapy, we're not just sitting in a room. We're not just sitting in this kind of abstract place. They're actually being invited to connect with and to start to practice some of these new kind of coping skills and ways of relating to different parts of themselves in the day-to-day process out there. And so each day there's time set aside for play or activity or hiking or doing different things in nature that allow for them to work through or have some of that kind of healing that can occur when we work through issues with other people. Sometimes there's tension around which activity we're going to do, or like Johnny doesn't want to do this, or sometimes you get upset on the basketball court because something happened and somebody else doesn't like it, or somebody blocked your shot, or again, you threw my Frisbee too far. There's all these different, so some of that reenactment of some of the same stressors, challenges that occur. But again, your original question was more about like, how do we invite them then to become involved in those activities, because that's part of the structure of the day. That's part of what our staff are creating day to day in the therapeutic process, because it's that important that we include it as part of the structure. Yeah,
I love that. Helping them find the play and the joy in those little activities that aren't just talking and aren't just sitting there, getting them involved and creating an experience and connecting them back in nature. Yeah. So powerful. I love doing hiking therapy is what I like to call it. When I've had a really tough day, just going, getting lost in the mountains and doing a hard hike. I mean, that's playful for me, because I get to enjoy the leaves blowing and the serenity and the quietness. And there's a lot of times I'll process really tough, difficult emotions that I'm trying to work through. Like one time, when my father passed away, I went on lots of hikes, just trying to work through that grief and finding joy with my daughters, finding rocks, different colored rocks, or putting our feet in the cool water. I mean, that stuff was so incredibly healing for me. I really want to highlight this research that, going back to Stuart Brown, who's a psychiatrist and head of the National Institute of Play, he reviewed evidence that play deprivation in the first 10 years of life is linked to a host of poor outcomes, such as depression, aggression, impulsivity, inflexible thinking, emotional deregulation, and lack of meaningful relationships. So ultimately, play is a biological need. We need to play, and we never outgrow it. We should always stay young at heart. So my question to you is, how can parents support or invite more play into their teenage life, especially when they're resistant?
Yeah, I think, and we've talked about this a few different ways today, but just the idea of like trying to connect with your child with interests that they have rather than interests that we have. So I know for years I tried to get my son to mountain bike with me, and that was just never his thing, but he was open at times to riding a bike around the city. He didn't want to get on the trail. That was too intimidating or too challenging, probably because I posted a lot of videos of me crashing and getting hurt, and came home with these scars and stuff, or blood running down my leg. But that idea of like, again, meeting them where they're at. So sometimes that may mean getting to, sitting down with them and engaging in the video game that they're playing, or finding out what concert they want to go to. Like I've definitely gone to some teenage concerts that I wasn't that interested in, if that makes sense. Because so again, this idea of like, how do we find ways to connect so that they will join with us at times in more family-oriented kind of play and that type of thing. And so sometimes that's meeting them where they're at, but also like trying to create enough play, so to speak, that they might be interested in the things you might do as a family. I think playing as adults is a nice modeling form. I remember just that idea of like, if I'm not playing basketball outside, why would my kids ever want to go outside and play basketball? Like if, again, that's just a simple metaphor of like, how do we invite them to join with us? How do we show our interest in these different things so that they can see, so that like our activities don't have to become their activities, but they can see that we're having fun, enjoying those things as well. And so as far as like, how do we invite our children? I think creating that space, again, our kids are often, especially as they get older, going to say no and not be interested, and that's okay. But that idea of like trying to create enough space so that we do find ways to have them join with us. And sometimes that's dinner. Sometimes, I said, that's concert. Sometimes that's, again, it's those small moments when sometimes we're driving home from In-N-Out Burger and we went through the drive-thru, and then they bring something up and they're talking to us about something that's going on in their lives. So trying to create that space where, even if they're not really talking to us because they're teenagers, that we're creating that space where we're not doing just the same old thing over and over again, whether it's like going from soccer to track to, whatever, all the different activities we sometimes sign them up for, and then trying to find meaning in those down moments where we are enjoying each other's presence or potentially enjoying each other's presence.
Yeah, which can be hard when you have teenagers and a family. There's a couple of things that, as you said, really sparked some ideas in my own head. Is my daughter, a couple of them love to read and have certain books. So there's been a lot of kid books that and young adult books I've read that I normally wouldn't have read, but because my kids won't stop talking about them and I want to be able to have a conversation, I'll listen to them. I'll dive in. I'm like, this isn't really my genre, but I'm in. Let's do it. We've gotten into Star Wars, watching Marvel together, and so they get excited about that. My husband has gotten them into Mission Impossible, and fun. So they connect on that, and they're excited to go to the movie that's coming out. We actually, for my listeners, I have a warm fuzzy jar that I started when my kids were little, where we have these little warm fuzzy balls, and every time they do something kind or helpful or service in our family, I'll be like, go put it in a warm fuzzy jar, and when we fill it up, we go do something as a family that's fun, and go find an activity that's together. And lastly, like, go plan a trip that there's no Wi-Fi. Like, get rid of your kid's phone. Like, we're like, oh, sorry, we're stuck on a cruise ship and we're not paying, that absurd amount of money for the Wi-Fi. Or, we're going to go camping and there is no Wi-Fi, out in the mountains. Do something where your kids have to turn in their phones and they don't have access to them, and pull out the card games. Some of my favorite memories as a kid was going for walks on the beach late at night with my parents, or playing Uno until 11 o'clock at night and just giggling ourselves silly, until the point where we were crying. Like, those were crucial, key memories for me as a kid growing up.
I think that's great. I think some of that routine that we develop as well. I know as my son, he's 20 now, but when he was younger, we created Tuesday night being Uno night.
Oh, I love it.
We would play that. And it wasn't even Uno sometimes that we played, but it was time, even if I wanted to punch him because he was being ridiculous. I don't want to punch my child, by the way, but that idea of like, he's being ridiculous. We'd still play something and we would do something, and setting aside that time or having that routine where it invited him to be a part of, or I was invited into his world, or whatever you want to call that. It was a nice way to find or connect or to do something that we just knew every week was going to happen. And sometimes I would miss, sometimes he would miss. So it wasn't, but it was like, 80% of the time that we'd be doing it. And in the midst of him becoming 16, 17, 18, it was, until he graduated from high school, it was kind of the thing we did, because that was just what we did on Tuesday nights. And so trying to create those kind of routines can be pretty powerful as a family.
It is part of your culture, your family culture. I think too, and one last thing to point out, I love taking a play therapy class in my master's program, because it taught us that, like, as adults, we come into a kid's world and we say, hey, let's do this. And we start taking over and take the lead of what they should be doing with the toys and how they should be playing with them versus stepping back and following their lead. And I think that's a great thing we can do with our teens as well. Sometimes I'll ask my husband, like, how did you get our so-and-so to open up to you? And he's like, well, I just didn't pressure them. I just listened and followed their lead. And next thing I know, they're just telling me all this stuff that they're interested in. And I'm like, oh, I get like 2 words from my kid in the car, you know? And he's like, yeah, well, I follow their lead. And I'm like, that's genius, you know, because that's what we learn. Instead of us being the one to take over and tell them how it should go, we let them do it and engage that way. And that really can take off the pressure of needing to connect, right?
Yeah.
What's one thing you'd want to leave with our listeners about play?
Yeah. We take ourselves really seriously. We're a world where, again, whether we talk about being busy or we talk about our jobs, or so much of even our identity sometimes can be wrapped up in the kind of the work that we do. And so at times that sort of like playful, silly part of ourselves can get muted. And again, back to that earlier research about the idea of like making sure that we're not muting aspects of ourselves, whether it's our emotions or parts of ourselves. And so again, I would invite our listeners to consider, like, how do you let that silly part of you out, or how do you let your kids be a part of that? Whether that's, again, like, I know for a while with my son when he was growing up, I would put on this particular hat and I would be James the butler. And I would be his butler, and it would be this silly aspect where he could order me around. There was a really great role reversal built into this as well, but it was like Dad's being silly because he's wearing the dumb hat. And sometimes, especially as he got older, he was less interested in this game. But certainly at different times, it was sort of this invitation, like, Dad's being a goof right now. He's in a good mood. Because sometimes I wasn't. Sometimes I was a real jerk. I was a bad dad. Like, I wasn't always like on my best. So again, in those moments of like letting our guards down, or letting them see more of us, instead of like thinking we have to be this parent that sends this message, or that, you know, like reinforces the correct things. And sometimes that sort of silly, playful thing is the thing that also helps them reconnect or be connected to their silly, playful. Because I think they're often doing that with their friends, but they may not always let us see that part. And so the more we can, again, whether it's called, what you want to talk about is like letting your guard down or letting them see that part, like that becomes, I think, a valuable part of the role we play as parents, is that they get to see more of us.
I mean, it goes back to doing our own work, being vulnerable, connecting with ourselves. I love it. I mean, if parents are having a hard time being creative and learning how to let loose, go watch the TV show Bluey. You're never too old. I have teenagers who love that show. We're all obsessed with it in my house. And it's just so good for all ages, and shows how, as adults, it's important for us to reconnect with ourselves and our kids and be playful.
Yeah, right.
So thank you so much, Matt, for coming on here and talking. I could talk to you for a long time. You're incredibly engaging. I love just picking your brain on these topics. Thanks for going over the power of play and why it's so important. In our next episode, for our listeners, we're going to explore how adventure therapy helps teens thrive. Why parents would choose adventure therapy when do they know they need to go, that direction. So stay tuned, and thank you again for joining us.